The palace corridors were quieter than usual that autumn morning. Behind the grand tapestries and polished oak panels, something simmered, unspoken but tangible. A change in the air, almost generational. King Charles III sat alone in the royal study, the weight of the morning papers folded neatly in front of him. "Windsor's End," read one of the headlines. Another, "William poised for modern throne?" The tabloids had a way of spinning speculation into prophecy, but this time the tremor felt closer. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. It wasn't a staff member or aide, it was Prince William. "Father," William said, stepping inside, his tone more assertive than usual. "No formalities, no hesitation." Charles looked up slowly, setting his spectacles on the table. "You're early," he replied. "I wanted to speak before the cabinet briefing." Charles gestured to the chair opposite him. "Go on." William didn't sit. "I've been patient, supportive, even silent when necessary. But the world is shifting, and the monarchy must shift with it. I believe it's time." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Time for what?" "For me to step forward." There it was. No hesitation, no stammer. Just the sentence that hung in the air like the chill of the English fog. "I see," Charles said, his voice measured. William leaned forward, hands clasped. "I don't mean to disrespect your reign. But you've done your duty. You've honored tradition. Now it's my time to define the future." Charles stood, slowly. "And what of the present, William? Do we simply discard it in favor of ambition?" "This isn't ambition," William replied, "it's responsibility. To the people, to the institution, to the legacy." Charles walked to the window, the autumn light casting sharp shadows across his features. He spoke without turning back. "Not while I breathe." The silence that followed wasn't cold, but dense. The air between father and son was no longer familial. It was political. Historic. Across the palace, aides exchanged nervous glances. The crown hadn't faced such an internal tremor since Edward VIII. But this wasn't abdication whispered in shame. It was succession demanded in daylight. William didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for abdication," he said carefully, "but for transition. A shared role. A co-leadership for a modern age." Charles finally turned. The room was lit by the muted glow of a grey London morning, but his expression was clear, firm, unyielding. "This is not a boardroom. It is not a tech startup. It is the crown." "That's exactly why it must adapt," William countered. "The public adores the monarchy, but they don't revere it like they once did. They follow people, not titles." Charles stepped forward. "And who do you think made that possible? Who carried this institution through scandal, divorce, loss, while never letting the foundation crack?" "I know your sacrifices," William said. "And I honor them, but the world we face now is different. Climate crisis, media warfare, global unrest. We need to be visible. Engaged. I can be that bridge." Charles narrowed his eyes. "A bridge without stone is just a rope." "Then let me reinforce it," William said. "With you." That moment, a son offering to stand beside his father, should have softened Charles. But it didn't. Because what William didn't understand, or perhaps refused to, was that the monarchy didn't just survive on relevance. It survived on mystery. On distance. On legacy so ancient, it could not be shared without breaking. "You want the crown," Charles said slowly, "but you've not yet worn its weight." William's shoulders tensed. "Then teach me." "No," Charles replied, turning once again toward the window, the mist of his breath visible in the cold. "You learn it by waiting. Just as I did. 40 years of it." Outside, the lawn was being raked by a gardener unaware that inside, history was being renegotiated in tones barely above a whisper. Charles's voice softened, but carried iron beneath. "If I hand you the scepter now, it becomes a baton. Something past, not earned. And a throne passed too soon becomes a stool." William's lips parted, but no words followed. The tension didn't burst, it thickened. The tension hung in the room like the ancient oil portraits watching from the walls. William finally sat, though not out of deference, out of calculation. He wasn't just a son anymore, he was a statesman, a symbol, a man being watched by millions. And his father knew it. "I'm not here to stage a coup, father," William said, voice controlled. "But if we don't modernize, we risk irrelevance. The crown must speak the language of its people, or risk silence." Charles walked slowly to the mantel, fingers tracing the edge of a gilded frame. Irrelevance? This institution survived Cromwell, Napoleon, Hitler. Do you think TikTok will bring it down? That's not what I'm saying. No, it's exactly what you're saying, Charles said, sharply now. That tradition is weakness. That mystery is failure. That duty can be delegated. William stood again. Then tell me what you fear. Charles turned to face him. I fear spectacle over service. I fear branding over burden. I fear that you want to lead the monarchy before you've lived it. The prince didn't blink. You think I haven't paid the price of this life? You've paid in tabloid columns, Charles snapped. I paid in silence. In dignity swallowed. In love sacrificed. This throne doesn't come with a crown alone, it comes with a muzzle. There was pain in his voice now. Real, undiluted, bone deep. For a moment, William saw not the monarch, but the man. The son who waited 7 decades in the shadow of a mother who never let go. The husband who couldn't grieve in private. The father who wore formality like a suit of armor, even at home. I'm not trying to take anything from you, William said, softer now. I'm trying to ensure it survives. Charles took a breath, his chest rising and falling beneath the weight of centuries. Then stop acting like it's already yours. A long silence followed. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben chimed noon. The bells didn't feel ceremonial today. They felt like a countdown. Down the hall, palace staff moved quietly, aware that something delicate was unfolding behind the heavy doors of the royal study. Inside, the silence between father and son had turned from tension to introspection. Two futures, standing on the same rug, unable to occupy the same space. Charles finally moved to the table and poured 2 cups of tea, not out of warmth, but ritual. As he handed one to William, he spoke with that polished clarity only decades of restraint could teach. Do you know what this room was built for? William shook his head. Confession, Charles said. Not the religious kind, the royal kind. Behind closed doors. With men who wore robes or medals, but always masks. William accepted the tea but didn't drink. I'm not wearing a mask, father. No, Charles said, but you want to remove mine. He gestured around the room, full of relics, parchments, gifts from empires lost and alliances frayed. This throne, this system, it doesn't endure because it moves quickly. It endures because it moves carefully. But care without courage becomes caution, William said. And caution becomes stagnation. Charles looked up, this time with genuine curiosity. And you think you're the courage this family needs? William didn't hesitate. Yes. A pause. Then a smile, not of joy, but of recognition. Charles saw himself in that reply. The same fire he once buried to protect the institution now burned in his son. And what happens, Charles asked, when the world you're trying to modernize turns on you? When progress becomes controversy, and popularity becomes a burden? Then I'll carry it, William said. Charles sipped his tea. You speak like a king. I prepare like one, William replied. For the first time, Charles didn't counter. He simply stared, letting the silence stretch. Not out of dismissal, but calculation. Then come to tomorrow's audience with the Prime Minister, he said finally. Not as heir. As shadow. William's brow lifted. You're inviting me to the audience? I'm testing your weight, Charles said. Let's see if the crown even fits. The next morning, Westminster buzzed with whispers. The Prime Minister had been summoned for a routine weekly audience, but the addition of Prince William had ignited a quiet stir through Whitehall. No one could recall the last time an heir had been invited into the confidential space of sovereign state dialogue. Inside the royal chamber, Charles stood near the window, hands behind his back. William stood just to the side, not seated, not dominant. Watching, absorbing. The Prime Minister entered with the usual bow, but his eyes flicked quickly to William. "A surprise addition, Your Majesty," the PM said, with a half-smile. Charles remained composed. "Consider it a rehearsal." William inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Observation, Prime Minister. Not interference." As they moved to discuss pressing matters, international trade, defense reforms, upcoming diplomatic visits, William remained silent. But his posture, his eyes, his restrained stillness didn't go unnoticed. Charles saw the corners of the Prime Minister's mouth twitch when William nodded slightly at the mention of tensions in Eastern Europe. After 20 minutes, Charles turned to William without warning. "Would you care to comment on the African Commonwealth Summit next month?" William didn't flinch. "Only that our position must evolve. Soft power isn't given. It's maintained. If we don't show presence, others will." The Prime Minister raised an eyebrow. Charles gave a subtle nod, approval, or permission, it was hard to tell. "Anything else?" Charles asked. William met his gaze. "We should listen more than we dictate. That's how relevance is rebuilt." Charles didn't reply. But when the Prime Minister left shortly after, his eyes said what his words didn't: he had just witnessed a transition in motion. Back in the private study, Charles poured 2 glasses of whiskey this time. He handed one to William. "You held your tongue," Charles said. "Good." "I wasn't silent," William replied. "I was measured." Charles let out a low chuckle. "Careful, William. That sounds like me." William smiled. "I know." The torch hadn't passed. Not yet. But it had flickered. And both men had noticed. Later that evening, the palace corridors quieted, but inside Charles's private quarters, the conversation resumed, this time without ceremony, without titles, just father and son. "You held your own," Charles admitted, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You weren't reckless." "That surprised me." William leaned back slightly. "You thought I would grandstand?" "I thought you might perform," Charles said bluntly. "Like so many eager heirs before you. But you didn't. You showed something more dangerous, restraint." There was a pause. Neither man looked away. "I've learned from your reign," William said. "The discipline. The silence. The burdens you carry that the public never sees." Charles nodded slowly. "But it is that very silence that haunts us, William. I sometimes wonder if I've hidden too well behind duty. Too many things unsaid, especially with you." William's expression softened, but he didn't interrupt. "I saw you today," Charles continued, "and for the first time, I believed, perhaps you're not just ready, you're already becoming." William looked down at his hands, folded neatly in his lap. "I never wanted your crown before you were finished with it," he said. "But I won't stand by if the institution you've spent your life preserving becomes a relic." The word relic hung in the air like an accusation, but Charles didn't react. Instead, he rose and walked to a cabinet tucked behind an armchair. From it, he pulled a slim black box. "Open it." William took it cautiously. Inside was a signet ring, gold, engraved with the royal crest. The same one Charles had worn as Prince of Wales before ascending the throne. "I had it resized," Charles said quietly. "On the day I became king." William looked up, stunned. "You were always going to give it to me?" Charles's voice was quieter than ever. "Only when I believed you'd wear it with weight, not want." William closed the box. "I'll accept it," he said, "but not as an end. As a beginning." Charles raised his glass. "To beginnings, then. But don't forget, crowns are heavier than they look." And for the first time in years, they drank not as monarch and heir, but as two men staring at the same horizon, each with different fears, but finally, a shared direction. The next morning, the media caught wind of William's presence at the Prime Minister's audience. Headlines buzzed: "Shadow of the Crown, heir steps in, Charles signals succession." The palace issued no comment, as expected, but the silence only deepened public curiosity. Inside Buckingham Palace, the temperature between Charles and William had shifted. Not warmer, not colder, simply clearer. Charles now saw William not as the boy who once questioned royal duty, but as a man who might yet carry it forward. But clarity brought new danger. That afternoon, during a scheduled briefing with senior advisers, Lord Pembroke, a loyal yet notoriously conservative aide, raised the concern that had lingered unspoken. "Your Majesty," he began, clearing his throat, "with all due respect, these recent gestures toward the prince, they're being interpreted externally as signs of abdication." Charles leaned back in his chair. "Interpretation is not confirmation." "Still," Pembroke pressed, "the press smells change. If you allow this to continue, they'll make the decision for you." Across the room, William listened, arms crossed. He didn't speak. "Not yet." Charles kept his voice even. "And what would you have me do, Pembroke? Shove him back into ceremonial appearances? Parades and plaques?" "With respect," the aide said again, "that's where he's safe." Charles's eyes sharpened. "Safe? The crown doesn't exist to preserve comfort. It exists to endure challenge." Then he turned to William. "What say you? Would you prefer a safer road?" William looked at Pembroke, then back at his father. "I'd prefer a meaningful one." The words cut clean. "No pomp. No posturing." Pembroke shifted uncomfortably. "Public perception will evolve," Charles interrupted, voice rising now. "It must. Or this monarchy will die with me." Silence. The kind that marked a shift in power, not a handover, but a repositioning. When the room cleared, William approached his father. "They think you're grooming me too soon." Charles smiled faintly. "They forget I've been grooming you since the day you were born." Then, with a nod, he added, "Tomorrow, Balmoral. You and I, alone." William blinked. "Why?" "Because sometimes," Charles said, "a king must teach his son not in palaces, but in places where he remembers being just a man." The Scottish air at Balmoral was crisp, biting, and clean. Gone were the gold ceilings, the royal guards, the rigid protocols. Here, the mountains ruled, and even kings walked humbly. Charles stood on the moor, wrapped in a dark wool coat, watching the horizon. William approached slowly, hands deep in his pockets, the crunch of frost underfoot the only sound between them. "I used to run wild here," Charles said quietly. "Before the crown. Before the weight." William followed his gaze. "I remember. You used to let us climb rocks you'd forbid elsewhere." Charles smiled faintly. "Because here, I wasn't a monarch. Just a father trying to preserve something untouched. That's what I've always wanted to give you, not the throne, but the stillness beneath it." They walked in silence for a while, past gnarled trees and silent deer. Then, without warning, Charles stopped. "Tell me honestly," he said, voice lower now. "Do you believe in it?" William met his eyes. "The crown?" "Yes. The whole of it. The institution. The legacy. The burden." William considered, then nodded slowly. "I believe in its potential. But not if it refuses to change." Charles didn't flinch. "And what would you change?" "Transparency. Purpose. Presence. Less performance. More truth." Charles gave a low chuckle. "You speak like a statesman." "I speak like your son," William answered. "I've watched the toll this took on you. The nights. The silence. The restraint. If I'm to follow, I need to know what it cost." Charles's face tightened. "Everything. Some days, it cost everything." They stood again in silence, the wind sweeping through the heather. Then Charles reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. "I wrote this when your grandfather died. I never sent it." William opened it slowly. Inside, handwritten in Charles's elegant script, "May I never pass on a crown heavier than I can lift myself." William looked up. "You still believe that?" Charles nodded. "I do. Which is why I haven't stepped aside." "Not yet." The wind howled. "But I brought you here," Charles continued, "because I needed to see something." "What?" Charles turned to face him fully. "If the day comes, and I falter, will you protect it?" William's reply came without hesitation. "Not just protect it. Reinvent it." Charles nodded once. And for the first time in his reign, he felt the cold not as a threat, but as a reminder. Of legacy. Of limits. Of what must one day come. The return to London was quiet, but not without consequence. Word had reached the press that father and son had spent 2 days alone in Balmoral. Speculation surged. Was Charles preparing to abdicate? Was William ready to rule? The tabloids feasted. But inside the palace, the mood had shifted from rumor to resolve. Charles summoned his communications team for a closed meeting. No aides. No lords. Just the inner circle. "I will not announce any transition," he said firmly, "because there isn't one. Yet." A murmur, then silence. "But I will begin speaking differently," he added. "Less distance. More truth. Starting with the Commonwealth Address next week." One advisor raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting a joint address? With the prince?" Charles nodded. "The world sees change as weakness. I intend to show them its strength." Meanwhile, William was already preparing. In his private study, he pored over drafts, notes, and policies. But he paused often, reflecting not on politics, but on the quiet exchanges in the Highlands. He was not being handed a kingdom. He was being shown its cracks. The day of the address arrived. The grand ballroom at St. James's Palace was filled with dignitaries, foreign diplomats, and media from across the Commonwealth. Flags stood beside royal crests. For the first time in decades, 2 future monarchs would speak on the same stage. Charles entered first, as expected. The cameras clicked furiously. Then, after a pause that felt deliberately symbolic, William followed, shoulder to shoulder, not a step behind. Charles's speech was measured, elegant. He spoke of service, unity, the shifting world order. But it was his final words that stunned the room. "In this era, the crown must not only represent continuity, but courage. And that, I see rising in the next generation." Then he turned, gesturing to William. The prince stepped forward. His voice was calm, but firm. "We do not inherit trust. We earn it. And I stand here not just as an heir, but as a servant of that promise. The hall erupted in applause. Backstage, as they stepped out of view, Charles placed a hand on William's shoulder. "You didn't sound like me," he said. William looked at him. "Was I meant to?" Charles smiled. "No. You sounded like a king." The applause still echoed as father and son exited the stage, but the real shift had already begun. Not in policy. Not in ceremony. In perception. Across Britain, newspapers carried the moment on their front pages. Charles and William, a united crown, the future stands tall beside the present, and in one bold headline from The Independent, "Not a farewell, a formation." In the palace, Charles reviewed the footage with Queen Camilla that evening. "He carries it well," she said, setting down her tea. Charles nodded. "He does. And he'll carry it differently than I did. That's the point." Camilla gave him a look. "Are you truly ready for that?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, looking out at the city he had known all his life, now shifting under new lights, new voices. "I'm not ready," he said finally. "But I'm willing." Meanwhile, William met privately with a group of young advisors, some outside the royal fold. Environmental leaders. Mental health activists. Former soldiers. He spoke less, listened more. What he wanted wasn't a modern crown in style, but in purpose. Symbolism only matters, he told them, if it leads to substance. Back at Buckingham, Charles received a letter. Not official. Personal. From a young woman in Manchester. "I never cared for the monarchy. But last night, I believed something might be changing. Not because you stepped back, but because you stood beside." Charles folded the note quietly. Later that week, in a rare unscripted moment, he visited a public garden in Bristol, no red carpet, no fanfare. A child approached him, maybe 10 years old, clutching a schoolbook. "Are you the king?" the boy asked. Charles knelt slightly, smiling. "For now." The boy hesitated. "And will your son be king after you?" Charles glanced skyward for a moment, then back at the boy. "If he keeps earning it, yes." The child nodded solemnly. "He seems nice." Charles chuckled. "That helps." That night, as the city slept, the crown did not feel lighter, but it felt shared. And for the first time in years, King Charles didn't fear the future. Because it was standing beside him, not waiting behind. This wasn't abdication. It was alignment. And sometimes, the truest form of power isn't in ruling longer, it's in knowing when to let others begin.